I want to again thank you for giving me the opportunity to give this talk today on my reflections. I changed my title because I realized that what I'm really going to be doing is a lot of stuff. So this is a talk about my reflections on how to give compassionate care from trauma. So I started my nursing career in the pediatric intensive care unit. And that experience, what I saw there intrigued me, and it also shook me to my core. I witnessed firsthand the profound impact that families have on their sick children. I also witnessed how racial bias can negatively impact the quality of care provided to children of color and their families with profoundly negative consequences. This clinical experience left me wanting to understand how psychological responses to adversity affects our physical health. So I went back to school and I got my PhD in health psychology. And I wanted to study, and ever since I have studied how people cope with trauma, a variety of trauma. I've also always wanted to be able to raise the awareness of my fellow health professionals about the impact trauma, stress and trauma may have on their patient's health, so that when we take care of them, we can keep that in mind. So, according to the 2019 Gallup Global Emotions Report, Americans are among the most stressed and worried people in the world. American Psychological Association Stress in America report progress. They basically say that over the last 3 years in particular, the rates of stress in America has been on the rise. Now, for nearly 3 decades, my colleagues and I have been studying acute responses to various forms of stress that are becoming much more frequent and severe. They're called collective trauma. We've studied things like terrorist attacks, mass shootings, firestorms, hurricanes, and in this work, we examine the early psychological responses and exposure to extensive media coverage that can impact our well-being over time. And what we've found across 3 large national samples is consistent with the Gallup survey. The vast majority of Americans report experiencing a major life event of some kind, stressor or trauma. Now, as you can see here, over 90% of each sample, this is the top bar, over 90% of the sample reported experiencing something. So these events included things like bullying, domestic violence, divorce, loss, community violence, etc. I then sought, after learning the pervasiveness of this kind of stress, I wanted to understand, because of my experience in the ICU, I wanted to understand whether these early responses to these events had an impact on our physical health as a country, because these are collective events. And my goal, ultimately, was to identify risk factors for trauma-related health problems and intervening to prevent, finding ways. If you know what the early responses are that are associated with downstream impacts, you can intervene, stop them, hopefully, early before they take effect. And that's the goal of my work. So in our first longitudinal study, which followed the 9/11 terrorist attacks, I examined whether the early stress that Americans were experiencing was associated with subsequent new onset health problems, especially cardiovascular ailments. Our study included a nationally representative sample, large nationally representative sample, who we followed over time. We had, the company that we worked with had collected 3 events, mental and physical health on them. So we knew what their health was like before the 9/11 attacks. That we collected follow-up surveys immediately after 9/11, 2 to 3 weeks following. So we had a survey of how much stress they were experiencing. And then we had annual follow-up health, followed them over 3 years on an annual basis to look at their health and how those early responses were related to health. Now, over the 3 years following 9/11, doctor-diagnosed cardiac ailments rose each year significantly. Now, you might say, well, that's expected, right? People are getting older, time is passing. Well, yeah, that's right. But the most startling finding for us was that even after taking into account all the risk factors, the age, the time, the cardiovascular risk factors like weight, like smoking, like endocrine disease, prior cardiac disease, we found that people who reported having high levels of acute stress in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks had a 53% increased incidence of new onset cardiovascular problems over the 3 years following 9/11. And this association, most importantly, was most pronounced among people who reported feeling both that high acute stress, but also extreme worry and fear about a future terrorist attack when we asked them at the 1-year anniversary. These individuals had a 3 to 5 times, almost 5 times greater likelihood of a new onset cardiac problem 2 and 3 years after 9/11. That's a huge effect size, by the way. That's huge. That's a very big effect. And so we continued our work after the Boston Marathon bombing. And what we found after the bombing was that because we had already looked at acute stress and their relationship to health problems, we wanted to understand, since most of the people in our 9/11 study were only exposed to 9/11 via the media. So remember, this is a nationally representative sample, which means that there were people in California, Oregon, Washington, Florida, Kansas, Kentucky, people all over the map. Okay? They weren't there when the planes hit the towers. Okay? About 60-something% of them actually saw the second plane hit live on camera, on TV. Another 30-some% saw it afterwards via the media. And a very, very small percent of our sample reported some kind of direct exposure, usually something like being on the telephone with somebody inside the towers. Now, so given that they were exposed via the media primarily, and yet we saw this impact of the acute stress on their cardiovascular status, we had the question in the Boston Marathon bombing study of what's the relationship between media exposure and acute stress? Right? We wanted to understand that. So we looked at that, and we got a much more fine-grained measure of media exposure. And what we found, as you can see here, the line is going straight up. As the hours of daily exposure, bombing-related media, increased after the Boston Marathon bombing, this daily hours, as it increased, so did your acute stress symptoms. Indeed, what we found was that the people with the highest levels of TV exposure, of media exposure, not just television, this is social media, this is all kinds of stuff. So people with the highest levels of media exposure after the Boston Marathon bombing, very highest levels, actually had more acute stress than people who were actually at the site of the bombing. You heard people who were at the site had less acute stress than people who watched extensive media coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing. And not only that, but we then looked further to understand how is this early acute stress linked to their health. And again, we found that the early acute stress is associated with new cardiac ailments after the Boston Marathon. It's also, and both of them are also associated, and this is the piece that was really a little surprising to me, but both the acute stress and the new cardiac ailments that people reported having, these are doctor-diagnosed ailments, both of those experiences were associated with difficulty functioning in life 3 years after the Boston Marathon bombing. 3 years later. They had a hard time functioning in their lives, in their social lives, and in their work. Not only that, but because we had the media measure in this study, a nice fine-grained measure of media, we were able to also show that by influencing the levels of acute stress, media exposure was also indirectly associated with the new cardiac ailments diagnosed with. So in this, the moral of this story is that not only is acute stress potentially hazardous to your health, but so is the media that may produce it. And not only that, but these things may have downstream impact out to 3 years following a particular event. So what this shows us is that not only all of this research, my body of research, is that not only is this adversity rather ubiquitous, but it can also lead to acute stress symptoms that are hazardous to your health, and that the media coverage of these events may actually contribute to that process. So I'm now working on a couple of follow-up studies to expand my work. One of them is addressing the role of lifetime acute and ongoing stress in the aftermath of experiencing a stroke, to try to understand how do these stressors and these reactions, these responses, these stress responses, impact a person's ability to rehabilitate or recover following a stroke and recover the functioning of their body. You'd be surprised. You'd think that people had studied this, right? Because having a stroke, you lose part of the function of part of your body in a stroke. To me, it's like an automatic, like, of course you're going to ask me how stressed I am. Guess what? Most of the vast majority of research doesn't take ounce of attention. So this is the first study that I am aware of that addresses all of these different types of stress in relation to recovery from stroke. In another study that I'm doing, we are seeking to understand our country's responses to highly publicized Senate Judiciary Committee hearing last fall, in which Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and then Judge Brett Kavanaugh provided deeply emotional testimonies, unleashing strong moral and emotional responses across our political divide in this country, making it a national collective stress that triggered memories of prior experiences and strong emotions for many, many Americans. Now, might be surprised to know that in the aftermath of the Kavanaugh hearing, what we found was that about the same number of people as we found in the 9/11 study actually reported having had direct, live media exposure. That many people, 62, 63% of a random sample of the American population, so almost 5,000 people from all over the country, said they were paying attention and they saw it live or listened live. And what we're doing with this study is we're hoping to better understand how these very strong emotions that were brought up by this event are affecting public health and our well-being. So, given the impact that adversity can have on health, how do we as health professionals respond, and what does it mean for us to be compassionate in the face of such trauma? To respond compassionately to our patients, I believe that we first need to understand the cultural context that helps shape both the adversity and our understanding and responses to it. The deep-seated cultural mores canonized in Horatio Alger's stories of poor boys becoming self-made men can have a profound impact on both our experience of and our response to trauma. The message of these stories promoted a deeply individualistic narrative about what we should expect from people who are coping with adversity. They say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. My colleague Dave Holmes and I were able to went and saw a movie recently, a documentary about what's going on in America today and some of the structural and institutional problems that we have that are contributing to health disease. And the answer, one of the questions that came up when somebody said, pull yourself up by your bootstraps was, what if you don't? This narrative is one of the core themes that has shaped how we interpret people's behavior as they cope. For example, we often expect people to get over the experience within a relatively short period of time and move on. If they don't, we think we may pathologize their response instead of thinking that it's a normal reaction to an abnormal experience. But psychological research offers us an alternative way to frame what it means to experience and cope with trauma. And it offers a new path for approaching our patients with compassion. It starts with the core understanding that human beings have a fundamental need to belong. As Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary wrote in 1995, human beings are fundamentally and pervasively motivated by a need to belong. That is, by a strong desire to form and maintain enduring interpersonal attachments. People seek frequent affectively positive interactions within the context of long-term caring relationships. Experiencing major adversity, however, especially when it's caused by human behavior, can leave people feeling alone, disconnected, afraid to trust, and sometimes on the margins of society. And this is why compassion is so necessary for healing from trauma. Compassion is the glue that connects and reconnects us, that fulfills that need we all have to belong. Charles Darwin argued that compassion was a universal, multifaceted human response to suffering that promoted evolutionary success. It is a form of social capital, a resource that we can draw upon in times of need. Psychological research has told us from all over the world that compassion has its own universal language, that we communicate compassion using specific facial expressions that are consistent across numerous cultures around the world. We have tactile gestures as well as vocalizations that we use that indicate to the recipient that we actually feel compassion. So it's also contagious. We sense it in others, and when we do, we are more likely to behave altruistically. And our actions may trigger what's called a butterfly effect. Butterfly effect is when you have one small deed done here that sets off a large series of events that culminate in a major event downstream. This butterfly effect was well demonstrated by a young man suffering from, I believe it was ALS, wheelchair bound. He was not long to be on the planet with us anymore. And he decided that he was going to go and give $50 to a couple of young ladies at a restaurant. He just went in and gave them money. And he said, I'm just paying it forward. And those young ladies then took that money and they used it to start an action to help support people who were in need. They took that money, instead of going out and buying the latest whatever, those young ladies said, you know what, we're going to pay it forward. We're going to actually do something with this that then ended up having much greater impact on people in the future, on their other people who were sick and struggling with a major lifelong illness. So it was a wonderful example of this butterfly effect. And I want to just say that sometimes we may not think that those little things that we do have an impact, but they actually do. They can. We can do something small that lets somebody else know that we really care, or that we respect them, or that we see them as somebody that's worthy of our not just our respect, but our time and our interests. And by doing that, we can powerfully impact how they then turn around and impact the next person they come in contact with. So, to behave compassionately, psychological research, One of the things we find with compassion as well, as Addie well pointed out, was that behaving compassionately is actually good for us. Not just us as givers, but us as recipients. And so we see health benefits like lower inflammatory response, we see lower blood pressure, we see greater happiness, people live longer, because they've lived a life of compassion. But what does it mean to behave compassionately? What do you have to do to behave compassionately? Well, first we need to be able to recognize the distress in other people. We need to recognize that a person is in discomfort, is distressed, or is in pain. When we recognize that, we need to make a conscious choice. And that conscious choice, and this can be hard sometimes, but it's a conscious choice that we need to do. And that is to trust them, to not blame them for their circumstances, but to rather understand that they are being hurt, they're feeling hurt and distressed in a situation. And then we have to make the inference that they need our help. And we have to be motivated to act. That is how compassion can be expressed. But there's others who have broadened the definition of compassion. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a powerful voice for compassion. To him, unconditional love was not a passive acceptance, but rather a moral imperative to act, to speak out and stand up for those who don't have a voice. He once said that true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Given this, how can we best show compassion for our patients who are coping with trauma? Well, trauma-informed care is a form of care that was developed by the national agency, SAMHSA, and it's a holistic approach to working with people that recognizes the powerful role that trauma can play in a person's life, their behavior, their worldviews. Trauma-informed care asserts that helping survivors heal involves creating a safe space, being trustworthy and transparent, providing the kind of support that empowers them, and more. It considers multi-generational and historical impacts of trauma and situates the current behavior that a person is exhibiting in the lived experience of that person's life, not in his or her character. And it looks for the human need behind any behavior that may seem dysfunctional or erratic. It says, what's the need behind that behavior? Why is that person behaving that way? What must they need in order to behave this way? But trauma-informed care has its limitations. The focus is on the individual, which is needed, don't get me wrong. People need individual focus and attention, and they need somebody to listen. But trauma can emerge from collective experiences. And violent neighborhoods, community disasters, systemic discrimination against a specific ethnic or racial group are all collective experiences that can create some form of trauma or stress that people live with. If your treatment for this stress or trauma is focused on helping the individual, it may actually leave intact the systemic forces that produced the trauma in the first place. So when they leave your care, your patients could actually go back to a situation that re-traumatizes them. That is a problem. So, and trauma-informed care also, while it's great for dealing with the individual and helping understand its impact on you, it focuses a lot less on growth and thriving in the aftermath of trauma. A lot of people don't think about this, but a lot of people saw it. Over 90% of Americans report having major stress or trauma in their life. If that many people are experiencing stress or trauma and people are functioning as well as we are most of the time, how does that happen? People are not always distressed or upset by trauma, or they don't always fall apart because they've been traumatized. Because people have supports, they have resources that can help them. And so there's another approach that was developed called healing-centered engagement. And healing-centered engagement, the tagline for it is, healing transforms people, people transform communities. Now, Sean Ginwright talks about this form of care for people who've experienced trauma as a collectively oriented form of care that places culture at the center of human well-being. It views healing from trauma as rooted in transforming the causes of harm in institutions to minimize re-exposure to that stress or trauma. It engages survivors in service to others as part of the healing. So it has built into it the ability to not only help the individual, but focus on the group. And how do we prevent re-traumatization? And how do we give back and help people grow? And that's part of the growth and the thriving that comes out of healing-centered engagement. So like the views of Dr. King, this approach casts compassion as being intimately tied to social justice, to making our social institutions more responsive to the needs of all people. And while I support this approach to helping people who have experienced trauma, I would argue that as we engage with compassion in our work and civic lives, I believe we need to do just a little bit more to make this work more effective. To me, compassion is a calling to be humble, open, conscientious in all areas of our lives, from our relationship with ourselves to our behavior in civil society. And to do that, we must look in the mirror and reflect on our own attitudes, our own beliefs, our biases, our behaviors towards other people that prevent us from truly seeing who they are and what they may be dealing with in their lives. We're all subject to making false assumptions, rash judgments about other people, based on our worldviews and our implicit and explicit biases. And these assumptions and judgments may lead us to significantly misunderstand, at the least, another person, or perhaps seriously harm them. We have seen this happen in many instances where unarmed black men and boys, inaccurate assumptions about them were made and leading to extreme violence being perpetrated against. We've also seen it in the form of assumptions, inaccurate assumptions that we make about rape survivors that lead us to color the society's view of what a rape survivor is or who a rape survivor is. And that leads to blaming the victim after the assault. So I would suggest to you that true compassion sometimes asks us to wrestle with our conscience, aka our inner voices, those voices that sit on our shoulders, like right here, and say to us, you should do this, no, you shouldn't, no, you shouldn't, you shouldn't. Those voices that we listen to. Sometimes I call them negative self-talk if they're telling us bad things about ourselves. Sometimes they're positive self-talk. But those voices are important, and they're part of our conscience. And they're part of what tells us what's right and what's wrong. And by listening to those voices, by paying attention and wrestling with those voices, we can actually have take more responsibility for our own actions and challenge the negative stereotypes that we may have, the key assumptions that we may make about others who don't look like us, who don't act like us. Let me give you an example. Don't know about you guys, but how many of you guys have been driving down the freeway and somebody cuts you off? Okay, let's see if we can get an honest answer here. How many of you are like me, and when that happens, think to yourself quickly, what a jerk. Okay, all right. We're all on the same page, guys. So, what does it do to say, what a jerk? What are we doing to that person? We're impugning their character. We're not thinking to ourselves, like, maybe that person is driving like that because what if they have somebody in the hospital that's really, really sick and they need to get there? Or, what if they've got to get to their job, and if they're late, they're going to lose their job, and they won't be able to pay their rent? We don't contextualize that behavior. We don't put it in a place that helps us try to understand the behavior we're seeing. So what I'm saying to you now is that we need to learn how to catch ourselves making these rapid assumptions about people that may impugn their character, and try to reframe our thinking to give them the benefit of the doubt. After all, isn't that what you would want them to do? You were behaving? I sure would. So, by doing this, we can commit ourselves to a path that transcends the rugged individualism of American culture and uses the glue of compassion to strengthen the intrinsic social bonds that connect us despite any racial, ethnic, class, sexual, or other differences we might have with another human being. So, pulling all this together, what I have come to understand from my work as a researcher, as a clinician, and as an educator is that we all, and I mean all of us, have a unique story and a life that animates us. And as can be seen in our studies, that story is likely to include coping with and surviving significant adversity. Truly compassionate care seeks to understand your story, your truth, and calls us to really see you, to accept you, and to advocate for you when we encounter institutions that perpetuates the adversity that harms you. To do this, we must be willing to challenge ourselves, to see beyond the stereotypes, the biases, the preconceived notions and assumptions we might have about another person, and refuse to use those to define you, and instead to give you a safe place where you can be yourself. It is my hope that by actively engaging in this way, we can cultivate compassionate action from the inside out. And in so doing, we can serve as agents for creating kinder, more just, and healthier communities.